friends, we're back with another Infinite Jest video. We got to page 400 a few days ago, but it was a super busy week at work. So now we're sitting down finally to talk about some impressions between pages 300 and 400. Brad's here with me again. And I thought I'd just start out by mentioning a couple things that came up last time, one of which was that we were talking about footnote 110, which is quite a long footnote, and footnote 110 actually has its own footnotes. So, you know, we got through that one. And then I guess I'll also just briefly mention the thing that I've been harping on this whole time, which is the female characters. I was excited last time because we had spent some time with Joelle Van Dyne, and Hal's mother Avril was also showing up, and then they both kind of disappeared again. So I'm still wishing for more female characters.
But you know, when it's Joelle shows up at the AA place.
Yeah, but she's not really. He doesn't.
Well, but she has that really interesting moment where she talks about the subjunctive, and she's talking about how misuse of language really bothers her. And so there's this moment of sort of the richness of. There's this possibility of real richness to her character. And I even wonder if that focus on the subjunctive and the hypothetical what ifs may kind of tie in with the book more broadly. I don't know. I'm holding out hope.
What if Joelle was just in the book more?
Maybe it's just that she's like some muse, right? And that's part of the weakness of the character.
I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Okay.
Okay, so we want to talk about code switching and dialects a little bit today, because that's something that I've been thinking about as I've been reading this. David Foster Wallace seems to really love playing with different dialects, and I think it's been giving us all a little bit of trouble because they read like kind of stereotypical, cringy passages. There's this whole thing where this Irish guy shows up at the AA meeting and he goes on and on about his poop. And I really skimmed that passage. I couldn't even read it. Partly because of the subject matter and partly because of the dialect. But then I got to thinking, and everybody else at the meeting is totally entranced with what he's saying because they're having the same bowel problems that he's having. And I thought, okay, well, fair enough. What he's saying actually is he's serious about it, and they're seriously interested in what he's saying.
Well, so, it's not your universal truth, but it's theirs.
Right, no, right, exactly. So then I was like, okay, so fair enough that he should go on and on about it, but the dialect itself was almost unreadable. But it got me to thinking about an essay by David Foster Wallace that I know I've read before, at least part of it, called Authority in American Usage, which was originally published as a review of a dictionary that had just come out. But I mean, David Foster Wallace being David Foster Wallace, it turns into something, it's like this really long piece on usage and politics and linguistics. For anybody who's interested, it was reprinted then in his collection, Consider the Lobster. But one of the things he talks about in here is code switching, and he talks about little kids who are the sorts of 6 to 12-year-olds who use whom correctly and whose response to striking out in t-ball is to shout, "How incalculably dreadful." They obviously get beat up on the playground because they don't understand that they need to speak in two different dialects, one in the classroom and one on the playground. I guess my only point is that he obviously has an interest in code switching and dialect, and it's coming out here, but not necessarily in interesting ways or even readable ways.
So, I mean, kind of what I hear you saying is that the analysis, the essay, is more perceptive than the application.
Right. Yeah, that's right. We've talked about that before, that there were some passages in the earlier sections that were written in dialect that was kind of cringy, and then it happened again there. You want to talk about Johnny Gentle?
Yeah, Johnny Gentle. Really tough character to talk about in some ways. My big conflict with Johnny Gentle is that he seems such a prescient writing of Donald Trump. He is someone who comes from an entertainment background. He's described at one point as the only presidential candidate who has
swung his microphone.
Right? And
he's also a germaphobe.
He's a germaphobe.
And they're wearing surgical masks, which, reading it now during the pandemic, that actually really kind of
Yeah.
was chilling.
But also this background in entertainment and in this culture where the pleasures are so intense and so embedded that there's one character says that it's the ultimate pleasure would kill you, right? Is that...
Yeah, I want to talk about that in a minute
Okay,
too.
all right. So the thing about Johnny Gentle is, on the one hand, there's almost this like straight line to draw with Donald Trump, and that's really cool and helps me understand kind of the appeal of Donald Trump. On the other hand, I'm wondering to myself, is there something more? Like, what's the other side of this that I'm not seeing that's not quite so linear?
Yeah. Well, let me read this passage. This is on 382, because actually there's even more prescient stuff in here. So Johnny Gentle, famous crooner, founding standard bearer of the seminal new Clean U.S. Party, which later gets abbreviated as CUSP, the strange-seeming but politically prescient annular agnation of ultra-right jingoist hunt deer with automatic weapons types and far-left macrobiotic save-the-ozone rainforests, whales, spotted owl, and high-pH waterways, ponytailed granola crunchers, a surreal union of both Rush L. and Hillary R.C. Keep in mind, this is published in 1995, so Bill Clinton is in his first term. So Rush L. and Hillary R.C. disillusioned fringes that drew mainstream media guffaws at their first convention held in sterile venue. The seemingly LaRoucheishly marginal party whose first platform's plank had been, let's shoot our wastes into space. CUSP, a kind of post-Perot national joke for 3 years, until, white-gloved finger on the pulse of an increasingly asthmatic and sunscreen-slathered and pissed-off American electorate, the CUSP suddenly swept to quadrennial victory in an angry reactionary voter spasm that made the UWSA and LaRouchers and libertarians chew their hands in envy as the Dems and GOPs stood on either side watching dumbly like doubles partners who each think the others surely got it. Gotta get a little tennis metaphor in there. The two established mainstream parties split open along tired philosophical lines in a dark time when all landfills got full and all grapes were raisins, and sometimes in some places the falling rain clunked instead of splatted, and also recall a post-Soviet and jihad era when, somehow even worse, there was no real foreign menace, capitalized, of any real unified potency to hate and fear, and the U.S. sort of turned on itself and its own philosophical fatigue and hideous redolent wastes with a spasm of panicked rage that in retrospect seems possible only in a time of geopolitical supremacy and consequent silence, the loss of any external menace to hate and fear. I mean, you can't read that today and not be shocked at so much in that really actually seems to have come to pass in its own way.
Yeah, and now there's whisperings of a center conservative party, right? So even the idea of it being sort of a third party movement is in the mix as well.
Yeah. We were going to talk as well about his treatment. This kind of goes along with the discussion of his kind of awkward dialect, his treatment of differently abled characters, which also is, I don't know, really cringy at times. I mean, there's a really nice passage at some point about Mario, and so Hal's older brother, right, Mario, who is differently abled, and their dad rigs up a head thing for him to carry a camera on. He can't play tennis.
It's like an early GoPro.
Yeah, only big. And there's a really touching passage where he talks about the relationship between the brothers, which for me kind of mitigated some of his treatment of that character. But then there's this horrifying passage at the AA meeting where this girl is describing her catatonic sister being raped by her father. And I mean, it's just so beyond the pale. And we're not supposed to sympathize with that character, clearly, because the footnotes keep separating out the voice of the narrator from the voice of that girl and the voice of Don Gately when he's speaking at the AA meeting. The footnotes keep saying, but that's not how they would have said it, or that's, but they actually would have used the word. So it's almost like he wants to distance, or the narrator wants to distance himself from what they're saying. I mean, you must have two narrators there. But it still, for me, was just appalling and so offensive. I almost didn't get past that. So I don't really know what to do with that. Like, I'd like to trust David Foster Wallace, but that passage really pushed it for me, like made it hard for me to stick with him.
Mm-hmm. Maybe that's part of it, right? How, like, what can I get away with in this narrative?
Well, so for me, he couldn't get away with that.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to that thing you mentioned before about entertainment will kill you, and this whole theme of excess and obsession.
This happens when the tennis kids are playing this crazy but really interesting game called Eschaton, and the game just blows out of control. There are a whole bunch of reasons why this game is fascinating to me, partly because I can see it happening. It seems like a natural thing of when you have a bunch of kids penned up together, things are going to go awry.
Here's another one of those scenes, though, that goes on and on and on, right? Like you get a play-by-play of the whole game.
Just wall to wall.
No paragraph breaks, nothing.
One of the things I found really fascinating is that Hal, who is sort of the David Foster Wallace character in the story, I think, is watching this at a distance, right? Maybe this is an authorial thing. Who knows what it is? But here's the passage. Hal, now leaning forward, steeple-fingered, finds himself just about paralyzed with absorption. Hal finds himself riveted at something about the degenerating game that seems so terribly abstract and fraught with implications and consequences that even thinking about how to articulate it seems so complexly stressful that being almost incapacitated with absorption is almost the only way out of the complex stress. So there's this image of being incapacitated, like your head is removed. You're just that far gone. And that's the only choice you can make to avoid this complex stress. I guess this strikes me as, because of the character that's thinking this, if that's sort of a David Foster Wallace character, does this apply elsewhere in the book? Is this a mentality that happens elsewhere in the book? Like, I wonder if incapacitated is just a little hint at the AA chapters. A big one comes right after this. Mm-hmm. And then it goes back to the entertainment and something that is such a desirable pleasure that it kills you.
Yeah.
Right?
Right. And I mean, that's the drugs, right? Like, and entertainment as a drug, but also literally drugs at AA, at the halfway house. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was a passage where, so we've, I think, talked before about the character Marath, too, and how he might actually be like the voice of wisdom in the novel. I don't know yet, but he says... he's the Canadian Quebecois, one of the activists who's anti-Organization of North American Nations. So anyway, he criticizes a USA that would die and let its children die, each one for the so-called perfect entertainment. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you can't help but think about the epidemic of opioid use and deaths, and then also the perfect entertainment in the novel that's killing people, and this experience that Hal has watching the game. And so it does seem like this theme of excess and the immorality of allowing that to happen to your society and to your children, and let its children die, seems to be at the heart somehow thematically of this novel.
Well, and one of the things about Marath that's always struck me, and I haven't really been able to articulate it, but now I think I'm finding it, is the scene with Marath and what's the other character's name?
Not Steeply.
Yeah,
Steeply, the
looking
spy.
out over the city reminds me of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Old Testament. Oh. And watching that blow up in its sulfuric way. Oh, wow. And that's a story about a city of excess.
Uh-huh. Well, we're going to have to wait and see what happens next. So when we get to page 500, we'll be checking in with you again. But that means, you know what? We're going to hit the halfway mark sometime this next section, right?
Yeah, it's hard with the footnotes.
Okay, that's true. So if you like what you're hearing and seeing, please subscribe. And I'll be back on Wednesday with another regular episode of Better Book Clubs. And we'll be back after we finish page 500.